Good morning. Welcome to the 10th session and concluding session for our conference. As folks are entering, I wanted to repeat a few announcements, but begin with thanks. Thanks to so many folks here at Elizabethtown College who have helped to make this conference as smooth as it has been. Thanks to Melissa Hegman and Barry Fritz, staff people here in Leffler Chapel in the sound booth, even as I'm speaking, the reason I'm speaking, that you can hear me, for the staff of special events and summer programs, for dining services, for Young Center staff and volunteers, everyone who did so much behind-the-scenes work to keep everything running smoothly, and I appreciate all of that. We have a great infrastructure here, and I just need to continually acknowledge that publicly. Again, for those of you staying on campus as you are checking out, bring your keys to the desk. If you think about it, you can leave your name badge in a box that's also on the table that's marked name badges, and we will try to reuse them as we are able to with future conferences. Again, after this session is over, the book sale area will continue to be open until about 12:30, so please stop by there. And I think even some of the, maybe a few of the titles that Elizabeth may be highlighting, the Anabaptist Witness collection of essays on from Ethiopia, the book, The Way of the Gospel in the World of Java, that's associated with the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism and so on, are for sale there, as is the Anabaptist Community Bible and a number of other books and publications there. As we come to the end of this conference and its subtitle, Past, Present, and Future at 500 Years, we think about the future, or I'm thinking about the future. There's been sort of a progression, probably obviously, in our plenary sessions as we've moved from the 16th century, thinking about what do we see. What are we looking at? What's our perspective on the 16th century? How have stories then and later been preserved? Last evening, thinking about what do stories mean in new contexts, also yesterday morning, but like sort of thinking about these things today, and how might we think about this in the future? Now, these are questions that, at least in my experience, the sessions that I've been able to attend, the simultaneous sessions, are all questions that wonderfully have been interwoven into the presentations, into the discussion, into the question and answer. I don't think I've been in any session that has been entirely historical or entirely contemporary or entirely without some reference to what does this mean for the future. So it's been delightful to have all these themes woven together. But particularly this morning in this plenary, thinking about as historians, but as anyone who cares about these stories, what might this mean? An Anabaptist story that is global and historical and contemporary and alive for the future. What does this sort of story demand? And Elizabeth Miller, the director of the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism in Goshen, Indiana, at Goshen College, is ideally suited to reflect on that question with us, with her talk, The Futures of Anabaptist History, Global Perspectives and Methods. Before arriving at Goshen several years ago, Elizabeth worked with Anabaptist churches in Colombia and Ecuador for 9 years with Mennonite Central Committee. She is the author of A History of Mennonite Churches and Mennonite Brethren Churches in Colombia from 1946 to 1975, and also a co-author with Lisa Weaver of the book Let the Children Come to Me, Nurturing Anabaptist Faith Within Families, which is also for sale in the book area. Elizabeth lives in Goshen with her husband and 2 children, and I'm very happy to welcome her to the podium now. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And since Steve thanked everyone else who was a part of bringing this conference together, I also think it's appropriate that we thank Steve Nolt, who has really been the driver behind the vision for this conference, as well as the manager of 1,000 logistics. So I would like us all to give Steve a round of thanks. So this morning, I want to start the plenary by sharing with you about another gathering that I was a part of last year. So a year and a half ago, in 2024, I attended a consultation in Mexico City that was hosted by the Comunidad de Instituciones Teológicas Anabaptistas, which is a consortium of theological institutions and Bible institutes in Latin America, North America, and Spain. And this consortium is called CITA for short, so from now on I will refer to it as CITA. So this group regularly collaborates on shared resources, programs, and strategies for the theological and biblical education that they're carrying out. And the purpose of the consultation in 2024 was to identify what would be needed in order to catalyze more contextualized theological education in their contexts. One of the major challenges that was identified within the space of that consultation was the need for more theological, biblical, and historical studies and resources that were emerging from within the representative regions themselves that could be used for Anabaptist theological education. In small group discussions, the conversation often centered around the need for new scholarship. How do we contextualize Anabaptist theological education with local communities whose contexts may be very different even within the same country? We have little local production and theological Anabaptist writings from Latin America. We should incentivize our students to write and dedicate ourselves to the work of writing. So the urgency around that question of new scholarship and Anabaptist studies at the CITA consultation last year was driven by pedagogical needs. What needed to happen in the classroom? How do we teach Anabaptist history and theology in our context, and what sources do we have for that work? And this urgency is not limited to Latin America. I have heard the same clamor for more contextualized sources from professors and church leaders in Africa and Asia as well. For those of us teaching global Anabaptist history in North America, the need for sources that consider perspectives and experiences from outside North America and Europe is equally acute. The daily work of teaching students in Anabaptist seminaries across the globe lends a pedagogical urgency to the question of sources and future disciplinary efforts. So this is a very practical question. This morning, I want to offer a survey of approaches and methods I see emerging in Anabaptist history, particularly among Anabaptist communities outside of North America and Europe. I will locate these methods within the broader field of world Christianity and use that disciplinary framework to suggest some direction for global Anabaptist studies. And I use the term Anabaptist here to refer to all groups that self-identify as Anabaptist or trace historical roots back to Anabaptist origins. So I'm not just referring to early Anabaptism here. I know there's some debate about using the term in this way, but it saves me from needing to create overly long hyphenated lists of denominational affiliations. And I also use it in recognition of the fact that many conferences outside of North America and Europe have consciously chosen to articulate their theological identity as Anabaptist, even when their denominational names do not include that label. I will also confess that given my experiences in Latin America, some of the examples I will share here today lean a little bit more towards that region of the world, although I've tried to include examples from other regions as well. So it is well known that the demographics of Christianity have shifted dramatically in the past 100 years, with the greatest concentrations of Christians today to be found in Africa Asia and Latin America, not in North America and Europe as had been the case previously. La Mansana, Mark Knoll, and Philip Jenkins were some of the most well-known scholars to call for new research and scholarship that took into account this 20th century expansion of Christianity globally. But decades later, after those first calls for new scholarship, the field of world Christianity still remains fragmented. There are deep disciplinary divisions that have often cordoned the history of churches in Africa, Asia, and Latin America to the realm of mission studies, while the history of Christianity in the West many times remains situated within church history faculties, church history with a capital CH. The term global Christianity, furthermore, has often served as a shorthand for non-European or North American Christianity, rather than referring to the full breadth of church and church history. The alignment of Christian faith with colonial power from the 15th century onward is partially to blame for these divisions, as European Christianity was assumed to be somehow universal and neutral, with all other expressions of Christianity as an adaptation of that universal form. Increasingly, global Christianity as a term has been used in a revisionist way, a correction to the Eurocentrism of the field. But disciplinary tendencies in history and anthropology have also led to a focus on area studies, and scholarship in contextual theology has complemented these approaches. And there is great beauty in this, right? What a delight to explore the ways that Christian faith is constructed and expressed in particular socio-political and cultural historical contexts. But there are also downsides with this approach, which have become more evident in recent years. German world Christianity scholar Klaus Koscharket has been one of the most vocal critics of what he calls the add and stir approach, that simply piles on more and more local histories from different regions of the world without seeking to connect to those histories in any meaningful or coherent way. Instead, Koscharket uses the metaphor of a map to describe the ways a new history of world Christianity could look. The challenge, he writes, is to place the various particular regional or confessional histories on an enlarged map of the global history of Christianity and to perceive them as parts of a larger whole. Even attending to the synchronicity of certain events and movements, I contend, can spark new insights, end quote. Koscharket speaks of new and enlarged maps, but other metaphors may serve us here as well. In this conference, we've narrowed our focus to Anabaptist history, with attention to the connections that have forged across traditions, time, and geographic space. And I think we've also attended to Koscharket's advice to notice contemporary movements and intersections in Christian history, the ways that early Anabaptism was perhaps more resonant with other people and places than we have previously recognized. Koscharket uses the metaphor of an increasingly detailed global map, but I would like to offer you another metaphor for consideration today, that of a mosaic. And yesterday I heard a presentation from Ryan Gladwin speaking of a kaleidoscope metaphor, which has a lot of resonances with this mosaic metaphor I'm recommending today. So mosaics, of course, are composed of smaller individual pieces separated from one another by mortar and arranged to form a particular image or pattern. Each individual piece of the mosaic is unique, with its own contours, its own form, just as a particular expression of lived Christian faith is unique to each time and place. The character of the mosaic is determined by its parts. Yet in their relationship to one another, something new emerges that transcends the particularities of the individual pieces. At the same time, a mosaic is not an amalgamation. It allows for both mixture and difference, to use world Christianity scholar Raimundo Barreto's terms. The mortar is a definitive characteristic of a mosaic. It simultaneously fragments the overall picture while also linking disparate pieces together through a maze of connections. In her memoir, The White Mosque, Sofia Samatar engages the mosaic as a way to hold stories together, even when their proximity produces pain and tension. Samatar writes, "These things, while they might stand beside one another, could never be combined. There was really no way to put them together except as a mosaic, that is, as a shattering." The shattering has been abundantly clear in recent years, as Anabaptist studies have made room for the grief of divisions, colonialism, racism, and abuse that fractures the story. Yet the same mortar that fractures also connects, tracing a path from a piece on one side of the mosaic to the other. As we have discovered in this conference, the act of comparing and drawing connections between different places and people brings into relief new possibilities and new perspectives. Samatar calls this the source of light, the illumination that emerges from holding seemingly disparate stories side by side. I believe we need both particularity and a sense of the broader networks and connections that allow us to even speak of something like world Christianity or global Anabaptism. But as the fractured form of a mosaic suggests, we also do this work in a world marked by inequality, barriers, and division. Those political and material realities matter to the way that we do scholarship, and must be addressed as part of the answer to the question, what are future directions for global Anabaptist history? This morning, I want to focus on methods that are currently expanding and deepening global Anabaptist historiography. I also believe that these methods can lead to greater equity and wider participation in Anabaptist studies. First, I will highlight participatory approaches to source preservation and creation, particularly in the area of historical archives and biography. Second, I will recommend comparative studies as an approach that can inspire new generations of Anabaptist scholarship. And finally, I will consider transnational networks, both as a subject of recent historical study, as well as a crucial practice for those in this field. So we'll begin with participatory methods in source preservation and creation. As you all know, historians depend on sources. Without sources, there is nothing to interpret, no narrative to draw out, and the challenge and delight of locating, gathering, and working with sources transcends all fields and specialties in history. Yet sources have remained a major challenge for those working in global Anabaptist history outside of North America and Europe. I will offer a personal example here to illustrate some of those challenges. When I was researching the history of the Mennonite Brethren in Colombia, I began with oral history interviews of elders and by working through the Mennonite Brethren North American Mission Archives, which is held in the United States at Fresno Pacific University. I think Fresno has actually been quite forward-thinking in their relationship with mission-descendant churches, and so they make microfilm copies of relevant mission archives available to national churches on request. They're also very generous with photo digitization and have prioritized digitizing photos from mission archives, sharing them online, so that they can be viewed worldwide and corrected or have identifying information confirmed in them. Yet, despite this generosity and collaboration, there was a massive documentation gap beginning in about the 1960s, right around the time when the Mission Board from North America began to focus its activities in urban regions in Colombia rather than rural ones. And that gap widened once Colombian leaders began to assume leadership of the conference regional and national boards, meaning that those papers and records were no longer sent or held in the north. So the regional church offices maintained some records and still do today, church offices do their best, but they are constrained by major space limitations and guided by legal requirements. So decisions about preservation are often guided by administrative concerns rather than historic considerations. So I began to ask at every interview that I did with elders in the Mennonite Brethren Church, do you have any documents or photos that you've saved that you think could be important for this story? And yes, they did. People pulled out old photos, which I promptly took to copy shops to scan. They had carefully preserved church attendance records in boxes under their beds. They had kept bulletins and church conference records in their desks. I scanned all that I could, creating digital file folders that I then turned over to the national conferences at the end of the project. But it felt like a haphazard solution. And I still worry that as elders pass away, future generations of researchers will have an even more difficult time locating crucial documents. Gaining access to sources held by individuals can be dependent on personal relationship ties and church politics, which also complicates the research project process, especially for younger scholars. Some seminaries have sought to fill this archival gap by integrating historic church archive collections into their library space and operations rather than having it held in church administrative offices. I'll note the Iba Seminary in Asunción, Paraguay, which was founded by the Mennonite Brethren, as one example. The photo up here is a photo of the Iba Seminary Library. And the room that you can see that has a stool sitting in front of the main window, that is where they store the church archives. Even in the best case scenario, however, there is rarely ongoing collection and solicitation of sources for archival preservation. So I would like to introduce someone to you to show an example of ways that some churches are approaching this question of how to save and preserve the history of their churches through the documentation that exists. So up here on the screen you see Ruby Barocio Castells, who is actually not Anabaptist, but Baptist. She is a Mexican Baptist church historian and the director of the historical archives of the National Baptist Convention in Mexico. She has connected with Anabaptists, however, through the Believers' Church conferences, which is where I first learned of her work. Her scholarly research is focused on the history of the National Baptist Convention of Mexico, and this is the church in which she was raised. One of the challenges she encountered in her research, however, was locating historical sources on which to base her work. She discovered that while the National Convention did have a small room dedicated to its historical archives, there was no order to the collection, and far more content was to be found distributed across congregational offices and in the possession of retired church leaders. This is a photo Ruby shared with me of one of the church offices she encountered where there were historical documents, but not kept in a standardized manner. That's it. With the support of the convention, she set about gathering, inventorying, and preparing proper storage conditions for the materials she encountered in her research. Despite the level of disorganization she sometimes found, Barocio Castells refused to feel discouraged. Reflecting on a room of disorganized papers she encountered in one congregational office, Barocio Castells concluded, "This encourages us because at the end of the day, these are testimonies." And here you see a picture of her methodically working through a collection of periodicals that she encountered in her work. She has since gone on to develop a practical participatory approach to starting a local church archives that she willingly shares with others. You can see those steps up there on the screen. I will not go through them one by one, But I would like you to note how her archival approach is notable for its participatory nature. She recognizes that the main engine for establishing an official church archives is not an institution, but rather the very individuals who've been carrying out the work of preservation in the absence of institutional guidance and investment. She argues that the creation of historical church archives begins at a local congregational level by inviting church members to share their stories and show their collections of materials with each other. Once that work has begun, the more technical steps of collection, organization, and digitization can build upon that participatory foundation and hopefully become institutionalized in the future. Barocio Castells led a training earlier this year with members of CITA, the consortium I mentioned at the beginning. And I hope that grassroots interest in archive creation continues to grow among the churches and institutions represented there. I would also note on this continent, the Mennonite Church USA Archives has recently created a series of trainings in archival collection and storage geared towards Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian congregations within MCUSA using a similar methodology. These congregations are underrepresented in the church's official archive collection. So archivist Olivia Krall developed an interactive workshop to help congregations practice identifying and preserving historical materials from within their community. The goal is that more intentional collection and preservation at a congregational level will lead to greater representation within the denominational archives and catalyze storytelling within and featuring Black, Indigenous, Latino, and Asian communities in MCUSA. I also thought Kat Hill's reflections on the considerations that drive collection and preservation are relevant here. And I think participatory archival initiatives can be ideal places to bring that dialogue out into the open at the precise moment when the purpose of an archives is central to community action. It's a chance not just to reflect on why and how those who came before chose to collect and preserve evidence of the past, but also why we in the present may choose to do the same. And as Jamie Pitts noted yesterday, this kind of conversation is ripe for conflict. There will likely be disagreements about why and how that should be done. But I appreciate how Barocio Castells starts with small-scale, tangible practices that can help people see the multiple purposes of preservation and the ways it can serve their community and others. I will now turn to biography as another type of participatory source preservation and collection practice. Biography has sometimes occupied a tenuous position within the discipline of history. In a 2009 issue of the American Historical Review, which was dedicated to the topic of biography, historian Lois Banner openly named history's anti-biography bias by saying, "Historians in general often rank biography as an inferior type of history. They see it as inherently limited because it involves only one life, derives from a Belet tradition rather than a scientific or sociological one, and is often written by non-academic historians who attract a lot of readers but lack the rigor of PhD-trained scholars." End quote. Beginning in the 1990s, however, social historians recovered the form of biography to more fully explore the ways that individuals simultaneously shaped and were shaped by their social historical context. Historian and biographer David Nassau has argued that the close study of an individual's life and the time and places with which it intersected, quote, reveal the ways in which their subjects assume, discard, reconfigure, merge, and disassociate multiple identities and roles, end quote. Within world Christianity, biography has been a particularly attractive form, both for the ways it is able to offer alternative perspectives of established institutional and colonial histories and for its accessibility. The Dictionary of African Christian Biography is perhaps the best known biography initiative within the field of world Christianity. It was originally conceived in response to a need for more historical sources that could help tell the story of the growth of Christianity in Africa. Today, the DACB is home to 2,700 unique biographies. Michelle Miller-Sig, the executive director of the DACB, calls the use of biography for African Christian history pointillist history, an allusion to the pointillist style of painting that creates full and detailed scenes out of individual dots of color, as seen in this painting by Paul Signac. Sig wrote in 2018, "Where traditional historical records are too rare to paint a general picture or to construct a chronology, even a few incidental and narrowly located narratives tell a partial story of the Christian activity that took place in a certain region." Biography in the African context allows for historical narratives that are not unduly shaped by missionary or colonial perspectives, which is what you would find mostly represented in a documentary archives. This allows African perspectives to come to the fore. The role of the supernatural in conversion stories, for example, is a more predominant theme in African Christian biographies than in mission records. Sig has also found that biographies in the DACB largely avoid depictions of the origins of Christian faith in Africa as an entirely foreign import, compared to that same tendency within Western scholarship. Biography furthermore provides invaluable insights into the ways that African Christian lives were shaped by larger social, religious, and cultural forces, and how African Christians crafted their identities in response, and sometimes in tension with those larger forces. Historian Wendy Urban Mead, for example, has used the biography of Nellie Malachwa from the Brethren in Christ Church in Zimbabwe to explore family networks, female relationships within the church, and the ways that individuals navigated shifting colonial and post-colonial realities in 20th century Zimbabwe. Oral history, of course, is a primary source for biography, given the oral nature of storytelling and historical memory in many cultures, as well as the lack of consistent written records. As Urban Mead has noted, the very subjectivity of oral histories provides insights into how individuals experienced and understood the forces at play in their church communities. They can also reveal the extent to which women's experiences and leadership were often ignored in official church records. SIG has documented cases where oral histories cross-check information recorded in colonial or church archival materials, offering an important counter-narrative from the perspective of church members themselves. The DACB is not the only project of this kind, however. The biographical collection of Chinese Christianity was established in 2006. Memoria Indígena is a project collecting the stories and experiences of evangelical indigenous peoples in Latin America and was founded in 2011. Both of these initiatives are smaller than the DACB in size, and each employs a distinct participatory methodology for expanding their collection, granting individuals the option to create and submit relevant biographies to these collections for editing and review. The DACB has published a detailed guide for those interested in researching and writing biographies in their context, and they also support a research fellowship for individuals who are prepared to write a series of well-researched biographies over the course of a semester. Memoria Indígena, on the other hand, is committed to supporting each indigenous community in developing their own methodology for oral history collection and biographical writing, depending on the cultural and cosmological frameworks appropriate to that community. There are Anabaptist connections within both the DACB and Memoria Indígena. The DACB is home to 15 Anabaptist-related biographies, for example, while 2 Anabaptist and Anabaptist-adjacent individuals sit on the coordinating committee of Memoria Indígena. The strongest argument for considering biography as an increasingly significant method for global Anabaptist history, however, is simply the notable increase of publication and biography projects within Anabaptist communities. Some of this publication is a bit more hagiographic in nature, intended to simultaneously inspire believers and instruct them about their faith community's past. Examples of this would include the extensive biographical publication of Doris Dube and Barbara Nkala in Zimbabwe, which spans multiple published volumes, as well as the Personajes que dejan huella entre los Anabaptistas initiative, which is curated by CITA and focuses on biographies from Latin American Anabaptists. And Jaime Prieto has also used biography as a way to tell Anabaptist history in Latin America in some of his publications. Mennonite Brethren scholar Yayakur Janamala's recent publication, The Life and Legacy of Local Workers of the MB Church in India, seeks to make more visible the contributions of 42 preachers, teachers, evangelists, Bible women, health workers, and social workers to Mennonite Brethren history in India. And in the introduction to his book, Janamala wrote, "Though local workers played a decisive role in all that took place, their contributions have not so far been given the attention they deserve." His words highlight the important place of biography in generating more accurate and relevant interpretations of Anabaptist history around the globe. A more comprehensive initiative is the nascent Global Anabaptist Mennonite History Series, which is supported by the Faith and Life Commission of Mennonite World Conference. This project will seek to encourage publication of high-quality, well-documented biographies of Anabaptists written by scholars and amateur historians from the regions themselves. During a series of biography workshops with Congolese Mennonites and Mennonite Brethren in 2023, Dutch-Canadian Mennonite historian Annika Fast piloted a participatory methodology that guides participants through the steps of conducting oral history interviews, locating sources, and writing life histories. The biographies that participants researched and wrote following the workshops in Congo will be edited and published in both hard copy and open access digital formats, with the goal of expanding some of the source literature for Anabaptist history in Francophone Africa. FAST hopes to be able to encourage adaptations of this model in other contexts, leading to regional biographical collections that can be used for both course instruction and as sources for more extensive study. Notably, Janamala and FAST biographies initiatives have prominently featured women's biographies. As a form, biography can serve to gather new sources focused on women's experience, as well as offer alternative perspectives on the unfolding of church history itself. Will Leviste is also here with us in this conference. Will, are you? There you are. And Will is carrying on a project that I would consider to be biography adjacent, conducting oral history interviews with African descendant Anabaptists from around the globe and collecting those stories together in what I assume will be kind of a pointillist history as well. Many of the projects and initiatives I have highlighted here are participatory in their very design. They recognize the reality that church members are closest to the existing primary sources needed for good biography. Oral history, obituaries, unpublished memoirs, personal records, photos. They unearth these sources for preservation efforts while also generating enthusiasm for historical storytelling in local communities and national conferences. At the same time, they produce new sources that contribute crucial perspectives to Anabaptist history, particularly those of women and lay leaders whose stories are less likely to appear in official records. Finally, many of these initiatives have integrated digital publication and access into their approach from the very beginning, ensuring that the biographies produced are more accessible to a global audience. Biography is just one example of the types of sources and publications that are emerging to fill some of the gaps in global Anabaptist history. Biographies, of course, are a really highly localized type of history, distilled through the lens of one life. A fuller picture of Anabaptist history globally will require broader study, as well as drawing those individual lives into a larger, more complex narrative. Much of the early scholarship in the field of world Christianity was focused on area studies, with particularly prolific scholarship from Africanists. Area studies have also been a primary form for scholarship in Anabaptist history, primarily focused on Europe and North America, but the Global Mennonite History series, published in the early 2000s, could be considered another example of area-focused publication. While the explosion of area studies in world Christianity remains incredibly relevant, some scholars have increasingly pushed for a more comparative approach that would explore the connections among the wide range of Christian historical experience. And again, I'll turn to a quote from Kushorka. By posing the same questions to divergent contexts, both analogous and differing developments in geographically separated places and heterogeneous political, cultural, and religious settings can be analyzed. So advocating what is possible with a comparative approach. I have been delighted to see this method used in our conference this week. In Tomoji Odori's presentation on early modern clandestine Christian communities in Japan, Danan Kristiawan's reflections on mysticism in early Anabaptism and 18th century Javanese mysticism, and Nicholas Terpstra's wide-ranging reflections on shifting horizons of expectation occurring across the globe concurrently throughout the Reformation period. This approach is also making appearances elsewhere. So in January of this year, this is the year of many, many, many 500th anniversary of Anabaptism gatherings. We are one of them. In January of this year, there was another one in Cusco, Peru, that gathered more than 200 South American Anabaptists together for a conference in recognition of 500 years of Anabaptism. This was simultaneously a pastoral and an academic space. So there were plenary presentations focused on the current political context of Peru, practical Christology among Latin American Anabaptists, and principles of early Anabaptism. But this was also an ecclesial space where participants shared about the context and ministries of their churches, engaged in reflection and context analysis, and sang and worshiped together. As is perhaps not surprising, major theological differences emerged over the course of the conference, including in the opening session on the first night. But over and over again, in the plenary sessions and lunch conversations and coffee times, participants asked the same set of questions of each other. How do we stay connected to one another despite significant theological and political differences? How do we live faithfully as followers of Jesus in context of such uncertainty and violence? What is the Spirit calling us to? What resources can the Anabaptist tradition offer for this moment and this place? And what does our experience contribute to Anabaptism? For many decades now, Latin American Anabaptists have drawn on resources from the 16th century to shape identity and dialogue with their own contexts. There were signs of this at the Cusco 500 conference, but I note that that approach has given way to new methods, including comparative studies. The plenary session that had everyone buzzing over the lunch hour on the third day was Costa Rican historian Jaime Prieto's morning plenary, which was a comparative analysis of the socio-political context and theological perspectives conveyed in two publications from the 17th century. Tielman van Braat's Martyr's Mirror, published in 1660, and Felipe Huamán Poma de Ayala's Nueva Crónica, which was published in Peru in 1615. On different continents, separated by the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, Peru and the Netherlands were connected under King Philip II of Spain's rule for a brief period in the latter half of the 16th century, just decades before the publication of both of these volumes. Prieto was chiefly interested in what Gianlucan's etchings, included in the 1685 edition of the Martyr's Mirror, and Juan Poma's illustrations in the Nueva Cronica, revealed about Christology in the 17th century. How persecuted groups, Incans and Dutch Anabaptists, made claims of justice and critiqued power through these illustrations, and the limitations and possibilities for leveraging gendered suffering in both Peru and the Netherlands at that time. These are valuable comparisons, even more so because there were political and religious links between these two places. But what I found most intriguing were the reactions to Prieto's plenary. People were energized. This was the topic of lunch conversation at all the tables that day. They perceived that Anabaptist history was not simply to be inherited and applied to their present context, but it could be put in direct conversation with the history of their own contexts. The Andean Conference attendees were inheritors of both the Martyr's Mirror and the Nueva Cronica, and Prieto's use of illustrations to explore that heritage opened up a whole new panorama of stories and applications for communities to explore. I also think Danang Kristiawan's plenary from yesterday is another example of how those comparative approaches can be used to gain new historical and theological insights. Comparative studies can draw in new conversation partners, new regions, and groups into Anabaptist scholarship. This picture is only tangentially related to this part, but it's a photo of downtown Bogota in Colombia, South America, and a cityscape of Addis Ababa at night. So thinking about these are two cities on the equator in the highlands, both with these Anabaptist communities in these urban settings. And I like putting them side by side to think about, even just with images, what questions come up for us as we think about comparative studies. Highly localized histories emphasize the intersections among individual lives, church communities, and their social political context. They draw out the theological innovations particular to each place and time. Returning to our earlier metaphor, these localized stories may be the stones or shards within the mosaic. And comparative studies can pull our attention wider, challenging the boundaries of the mosaic itself, stretching and extending those borders. New shapes and forms may come into view, helping us to see what was previously undetected. And this is where, admittedly, the mosaic metaphor breaks down a bit, because mosaics can certainly be added to, but their pieces are fixed. The mortar is set in a mosaic. So maybe for our purposes here, we can imagine the mortar as a semi-solid, somewhat like the Earth's magma that allows for some shifting to take place. And then still, there is the fuller picture of the mosaic itself. Some long to see the entirety of the mosaic all at once, and I think this has come out in our conversations here this week. What would it mean to have a comprehensive Anabaptist history in the same way that we speak of church history with a capital CH? Something that attempts to capture the scope, complexity, and plurality of Anabaptism in one narrative. I will freely admit that this is not the work I feel called to do, but I have detected a desire for it among Anabaptists globally. There is a longing to see Anabaptisms from across 500 years gathered together, connected, contrasted, and narrated in relationship to one another. Historians Joel Cabrita and David Maxwell, who are both Africanists, have argued for the same within the field of world Christianity, calling for, quote, a research agenda that is attentive to connections as well as rupture between different parts of the globe, end quote. They critique the field's myopic focus on the particularity and the local, recognizing that many local groups of Christians around the world do not, in fact, identify themselves with as great a degree of particularity as is assumed of them in related scholarship. Rather, they understand themselves to also be belonging to a global communion of other Christians. This is true for many Anabaptists as well, who see themselves as belonging to a historic Anabaptist trajectory, as well as to a global communion of Anabaptists in the present. Post-colonial perspectives have rightfully sought to decenter the West and narrate Christianity from other angles. An exclusive emphasis on the highly contextual, however, can obscure the networks that have facilitated or obstructed the flow of ideas, people, and resources within global Christianity. Both of these realities have undercut possibilities for perhaps a more comprehensive global Anabaptist history, and I'm grateful to this conference for inviting us to pay attention to greater connectedness within and beyond Anabaptist stories. As I mentioned before, there are gaps in my knowledge and my vision to be able to speak on to how a more comprehensive approach to global Anabaptist history could happen. What I can say with full conviction, however, is that I believe future Anabaptist scholarship will reflect the growing focus in world Christianity on transnational networks and how they have shaped both theology and Christian practice. Recent scholarship on the development of Protestant theology in Latin America in the second half of the 20th century, for example, has been focusing on the role of ecumenical and transnational networks in that development. I am currently researching the ways that transnational networks among Anabaptists in Latin America in the 70s, 80s, and 90s accelerated the development of contextualized Anabaptist theologies in that same period. Jaime Prieto is writing a detailed history of CAMCA, which is the Central American Mennonite Conference that has met annually since 1974 and played a significant role in cultivating a transnational Anabaptist identity among churches in that region. Samuel Bucher is exploring transnational identity among Low German Anabaptists in Latin America and the ways that identity has been leveraged to sustain economic development for communities within those transnational connections. Transnational networks are not simply a subject for historical attention, however, they are also a practice for advancing new scholarship in Anabaptist history. I've already recounted some of these methods in the plenary, including the online biography collections, the Cusco Gathering, grassroots archiving initiatives. And in this conference, I was delighted with Rosalind Byler and Adesi Nwingwe's introduction to the Print Project, which is simultaneously focused on mapping connections among religious migrants, as well as increasing engagement with the sources themselves. One of the realities of Anabaptist history in global context, however, is that these methods may not always result in texts that are published through indexed academic journals or books edited and published through academic presses. And so the question, what is happening in the field of global Anabaptist history, many people look to those places and those platforms to answer that question. But I argue there is a tremendous amount of work and research happening outside of those platforms, which are prohibitively expensive for smaller institutions and independent researchers to access. Ethicist Christoph Stuckelberger and librarian Amelie Vallotton have identified the ways that these structures of library databases in particular, but also the way publication works, especially in the global north, create a self-perpetuating cycle that generates barriers. They say, in the South, many people do not have access to information and knowledge from the global North because it is too expensive. Whereas in the global North, many people do not have access and knowledge from the global South because it's not distributed in the channels they normally use. Yao Chu Lak, who's the former executive secretary of the Association for Theological Education in Southeast Asia, addressed the issue of resource inequality more directly in 2010, when he said not only should there be a global redistribution of wealth for theological education, but also, quote, new systems of global solidarity that can sustain theological education across these barriers. So since 2010, open access publishing and digital libraries have helped to address some of these challenges by making scholarship available without paid subscriptions, but major gaps exist. And for Anabaptist studies, which I think is a particularly relationally thick field, I see some of the most effective approaches for navigating these barriers when strategies for publication and sharing of resources are mapped onto existing transnational networks sustained by individuals. So this morning, I'll just offer a few brief examples of networks that have resulted in greater resource sharing and publication. So I will start with noting, up on this slide, there is an image of a journal called Relea, which is the one that has the green band going across the front on this side. This journal is entitled the Latin American Network of Anabaptist Studies, or Relea. It's a peer-reviewed journal. It's been published since 2017. It was initially only published in hard copy, but in the last few years has also been publishing in an open access form online, so you can go and read it from anywhere in the world where you have internet access. They have focused on issues of war, peace, migration, the COVID pandemic, gender violence, all from a Latin American Anabaptist perspective. But if you search any of these topics in Google Scholar or library databases, not a single Relea article will appear in those search results. The scholarly work is being done. You don't even have to have a paid subscription to access it, but because Relea has not been indexed, you cannot find it through the normal channels that you would use to find things in a library database or on Google Scholar. So there's a relatively simple solution for this. Earlier this spring, the Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism and Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, their library, we worked together to present Relea to ATLA, which was formerly the American Theological Library Association. ATLA reviewed the academic rigor of the journal and the editorial board of Relea and said, yes, absolutely, this is an academic journal that qualifies for indexing. So Relea will now soon be indexed in ATLA's system, which will allow Relea results to populate in ATLA and Google Scholar searches. But this is a simple example of the ways that these barriers work to keep conversations from crossing across some of those barriers of systems and platforms. Another example of where I think transnational networks have led to greater initiatives in publishing is through the journal Anabaptist Witness under Jamie Pitts's leadership. Has been particularly innovative, committed to open access and building on relational and institutional networks as well as multilingual publishing. And I particularly want to highlight last year's Anabaptist Witness issue, which was focused on mission and peace in Ethiopia, edited by Henak Makonnen, who is here, and James Cravel, who is also here, as an example of the ways that global solidarity in publishing can carve more established channels for scholarly exchange and respond to urgent pedagogical needs. This issue broke down some of the barriers that keep scholars from encountering each other's work. Those in North America gained greater familiarity with Ethiopian scholarship, and Ethiopian scholars gained greater visibility. This issue was published in digital and hard copy, so it can be added to physical library collections and used in seminary courses at a global level. And as Steve mentioned, you can also purchase it in the bookstore before you leave today. Another example would be the collaborative devotionals that have been developed by the movement of Latin American women doing theology in Latin America. This is a network, a rather loose network that has existed for 20 years now. During the pandemic, the lockdowns in Latin America were very intense, so people could not gather, could not see each other for long periods of time. And during the pandemic, the question arose, how can we, as women in this network of Anabaptist theologians, stay connected during this time? And they came up with the idea of creating a devotional book. So they solicited entries from women across this network, one for each day of the year. So the devotional volume has 365 entries, each written by a Latin American Anabaptist woman who reflect on biblical texts, on Anabaptist history and Anabaptist principles, on their own context and how they understand themselves to be living their faith in that context. This was published online, so it could be accessed by anyone, and actually during the pandemic, the devotionals were recorded in audio form and shared far and wide on WhatsApp. What was of great interest to me was during the Cusco 500 gathering, that text of the devotional collection from 2021 was used by 2 plenary speakers as a theological source for their presentations. So this is an example of the ways that physical, relational, transnational networks can generate sources that can then lead to further and deeper study within Anabaptist studies. Okay, I'm skipping ahead. I want to conclude by returning to a paradox that is core to the definition of a mosaic and, to my view, to the field of global Anabaptist history. In a mosaic, as we've already noted, there's particularity and universality, connection and rupture. The inescapable reality of a mosaic is that it is a fragmented whole. And here we return to this earlier emphasis on pedagogy. What are the sources and tools we have for teaching Anabaptist history and theology, and to what end? In his book, After Whiteness, Willie Jennings powerfully reflects on the ways that faith and theological education are also inherently fragmented. The goal is not to insist, for Jennings, that knowledge is always incomplete, nor that it's endlessly constructed, although those may be partial truths. Rather, the idea of fragmentation speaks to the reality that the world is always too much for us to hold at once. We creatures live in pieces, and we come to know our redemption in pieces. That's true for Christian history as much as it is true for us today. And in a present shaped by the sins of racism and colonialism, which has shattered the cultural and religious worlds of so many, and with the weight of a history that has been formed by division and separation, the work of Christian history and theology, including Anabaptism, can only be done ankle deep in the fragments. Rather than seeking to restore fragmented worlds, Jennings envisions, quote, a drawing of those pieces together, of throwing them in the air, of allowing the Spirit of the living God to take those pieces and fit them together in new and life-giving ways that would be familiar and also new, end quote. Ultimately, this is what I hope for those of us gathered here, that we can tolerate the discomfort of the fragments, that we can allow for rupture, that we can hold both the particular and the universal together in our work, that we notice and make space for participatory processes that allow this work to be as deeply embedded in church communities as it is in academic faculties, that we can nurture new channels of access and connection where they emerge, and that the transnational networks that may first germinate in a gathering like this can send up tendrils and bear fruit to become something new and life-giving for others. And in so doing, we may come to find that the mosaic we thought we knew is in fact far more expansive and surprising than we had thought. Thank you. And I apologize, that was unduly long. But I would love to hear any questions or responses or connections that you were making listening to my sharing this morning. And as with all the plenary sessions, the mics are up here on the front. So if you do have comments to share, you'll need to come over to the sides to those mics that are available.
Thank you. My question is about your participatory history gathering. And as an archivist by profession, I was pleased to see those steps that were put forth. What I didn't see, though, is any mention of a place to store these items, or was that just too basic, a given, or how can you address the importance of having a central place? One of your slides, and you showed and you mentioned about how, and I encounter this in my work all the time, when, especially with churches, that records are in people's homes and scattered, and then they move. And what about the importance of one central location that doesn't move, or probably doesn't move?
That, of course, is the ideal and everyone's dream. I think it's also true that that dream cannot always become reality, but I think what these participatory processes can demonstrate is that it doesn't have to be one or the other. Like either you have nothing or you have a fully established, institutionalized, large space with ideal conditions to store archives. And so Barocio Castells, when she talks about this, she talks about, first of all, digitize. If you have these kind of gatherings where people bring their sources in that they want to share with each other, even if people are not willing to give those up, it may be hard for people to actually say, oh yes, I'm willing to turn this over for caretaking by someone else. Those can at least be digitized so that there is a record of them that then can be accessible to others, and that could be held by some central entity. It can also be the archiving initiative that I mentioned that MCUSA is carrying out. They are initially encouraging these congregations to, within their own space as a congregation, begin to think a little bit more carefully about what they're saving and how they're saving it. And that does not require a large amount of space. It may require a few boxes. Barocio Castells had the experience of, as she was doing this work, enough enthusiasm was generated from the ground up that the denomination actually invested in it and has now established a permanent archives within the space of the denomination seminary. But I think I just hope to avoid that either or dichotomy, that there is a range of solutions, even if the ideal isn't possible in the moment. But yeah, great question.
Good morning. Do you see a role for artificial intelligence in organizing the digital records that you're accumulating?
I do not know.
Okay.
No, I don't know. I think artificial intelligence can be probably, the ways that I have considered using it with records would mostly be in the area of oral history, helping to generate transcripts that can then be gone through, or pulling some main themes from interviews before there's time for someone to sit down and actually go through it in a more careful manner. But I do not have enough experience or knowledge of AI tools to speak to organization of records. If someone else does, you're welcome to share.
Hi, I'm Jonathan Scarr. I'm thinking about the value of having different groups and communities working on preserving their histories and their spaces. I'm at an institution in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia where there's a lot of effort to talk about the local history of Anabaptism in that area. And so we have a center to do that for those who are engaged, but there are 17 different Mennonite groups in our valley, each with their own reasons for being apart from one another while being in the same geographical context. And they have various levels of interest in preserving their own histories. And so when trying to build this mosaic, there are these kinds of challenges to having those volunteers and those efforts to be part of that participatory building of stories. And so I'm wondering if you have any insight about how to motivate or encourage what can be done to help draw people into sharing those stories alongside each other and helping to preserve their own stories.
I'm sure many of you who work in historical associations have many better answers to this question and much more experience doing it. The reality, as you acknowledge, is that participatory processes take a lot of time and a lot of setup ahead in order to be able to execute it well. So they're not something that can be done kind of quickly or off the cuff very easily. One example that I have seen being successful is actually, and this connects to some of Kat Hill's presentation yesterday, but photos and material objects are a great way to get people talking. So you can have kind of show and tell nights or show and tell events where you invite people to bring in photos that have to do with either a certain subject, a certain time period, a certain place, and bring those photos in, and that is a way to generate storytelling relatively easily. The same thing with material objects. If you provide a focus for what kind of object to bring, what kind of story should it tell, those can often be ways to get people talking in a participatory way. And then, of course, there's a lot of work on the back end if you want to document what photos there were, who should be followed up with later. But that is a form that I have seen spark interest relatively easily.
Also, in order to get those conversations started, it's important to advocate for why it's important for people to tell their stories. So advocacy is also an important part of this, important piece of the puzzle. You have to tell them why your organization is important to them, why they should choose to house their stories at your organization, what your mission has to do, your organizational mission has to do with their lived experience as members of a congregation. You should speak to why your organization is a place for them to store their stories and why it's important to have these resources there so that church members can access them in the future and so that researchers can find these records and just find out more about your history. All of those steps that were listed there were great, and advocacy is also a really important piece of that. So that would be my advice to the question of how do we get all these disparate groups to speak about their experiences. There's individual differences with each congregation. At my institution, I'm at Mennonite Life. We have two different conferences, but they've both chosen Mennonite Life as their repository, and so it's important to speak to the needs of each individual congregation as well as to the two different conferences and their different points of view. And just make sure that they know that why Mennonite Life is a good place for them to store their records and why it's important to us to be sharing their stories with researchers and church members who may come in.
Yes, thank you. And I think Mennonite Life is particularly adept at that advocacy piece, and I often reference Mennonite Life for my own work as how can I do that better.
Hi, thank you so much for the amazing work you're doing with ISGA and in other ways too. I was curious, you mentioned at least one or two projects that are working on oral histories or collecting oral histories or interviews or things like that. And I was curious, sorry, I missed the name of the person who was doing the one you mentioned, but I was curious about if you know more about how they're doing that. And I was also curious if you know of other projects in any of the locations that you've been or looked at that are focusing more on collecting oral history in some way, or I don't know, do you have more to say about where that's going?
I mentioned Will Levis' project with, is that the one you're thinking of, the Afro Anabaptist stories?
That one, and didn't you mention another one that was Latin American? I may have misheard.
Okay, let me go back.
That's
I
okay.
can remember. Jaime Prieto has kind of been the Anabaptist historian who I think has collected the largest amount of Anabaptist-related oral histories. So he has, I project, well over 300 oral histories that he's carried out in Latin America. The Institute for the Study of Global Anabaptism has digitized 200 of those to protect them from deterioration in their current form as cassettes. But another project that may be what you're referring to is the biography project that is connected to the Faith and Life Commission of Mennonite World Conference. Part of the training for participants who wish to be a part of generating biographies for publication within that project go through an oral history training, and then as part of their research conduct oral histories and are taught how to preserve them. So oral histories can be conducted, but we also want those to be preserved so they can be referenced for future research as well. So that project is intentionally working on soliciting new oral histories, but also on preserving the ones that are generated within the scope of that project.
My name is John Roth. Amidst all of the practical and logistical questions that have emerged in response to your presentation, I want to also underscore the really, to my way of thinking, profound framing of the question, the larger set of questions that you have mapped out here in the past hour. Although you didn't talk explicitly in theological terms, I think the vision that you've presented is deeply informed by a theological awareness, a sensitivity to our commitment to a participatory vision, a recognition of the fragmentation and yet the call in the midst of that to an overarching shared narrative that we hope doesn't go out of focus. And I hope that 20 years from now, future historians will look back to this conference and frankly your presentation as a moment where a vision was cast that maybe some people, young people in this group, are ready to take up. You said you weren't the one who was going to try to pull these area studies together in a comparative form, or I'm not sure what that shape will take. But this is a really significant vision. And I hope we know to appreciate how significant what you just presented was. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you for that, John. And also, it should be underscored that that vision is a testament to these very networks that are represented in this room and those connections that have formed and shaped each of us and continue to open our perspectives more broadly with every encounter and relationship we develop. And so it feels very fitting to be talking about this with a group of people who represent so many different communities and places around the globe. And I'm grateful for the chance to do that. Thank you.
Yes, my name is Andi Santoso. Yes, I just want to express deep gratitude as well, just being here and listening to many of these presentations. And as I just reflected on my past experience in Stuttgart and Zurich, we attended the celebrations of Mennonite World Conference for 100 years, and then in commemorations of Anabaptist history, 500 years. You can imagine how to unpack those moments, and also sitting here. So this mosaic imagination is really interesting, and so I just want to express thank you, as John wrote. I think this is just the beginning of envisioning the next 500 of Anabaptist story and histories. So maybe this can be a good start. This morning I woke up with the reflection, like listening all of this. I wrote in my note, like, unfinished Anabaptist stories. So I think we need to keep on writing, keep on living, embodying our lives as Anabaptists, no matter our backgrounds, race, ethnicities, nationalities. We are called to follow Jesus, living out unity and building peace. This is not Mennonite World Conference tagline, but this is important. I think we need to keep on writing, using these tools that you have shared, and collaboration. And one affirmation is, we started a consultation around 2 years ago in Asia, and we just officially formed Asia Anabaptist Mennonite Education Network. You just talk about transnational networks. So I just want to affirm this vision. So thank you.
Thank you, Andios. I'm very glad to know about that network, too.
Well, again, thank you, Elizabeth, for what you shared, both in the details and, as John said, in that vision. So thank you. Thanks to all of you for participating in so many ways in this conference, as presenters, as asking thoughtful questions and discussion and networking, and it's just wonderful to see everyone here together. I think I said as the opening, I was standing in the lobby Tuesday around noon, and just noticing old and new friends gathering from so many different places, and it was just a really great feeling, and it's been a wonderful 3 days. A final logistical announcement that's more of a reminder. Those of you who are visiting Muddy Creek Farm Library, another remarkable collection and collecting enterprise, you should go to the Young Center lobby, where you will meet Edsel Burge. Those of you who are going to the 1719 Museum, which is another interesting example of comparative history in many ways, should meet in the lobby. I know a lot of us are going to be in the lobby, but maybe I'll just suggest you meet on sort of this side, which would be to your right as you're sitting now, my left part of the lobby, and you'll be meeting with Luke Mackey, and Luke will be directing you to where you'll be leaving this building to find lunch in the van for that tour. For everyone else, wish you safe travels the rest of your journeys home, whether you're from here in Lancaster County or in a number of cases traveling to a very different part of the globe than Lancaster County. Thank you very much for coming.